Thanks for coming along today. It's lovely for everybody to join us today. Thank you so much for doing that. My name's Jo Chamberlain. I'm the Heritage and Participation Officer for the Atkinson in Southport. I'm just going to be here just to quickly tell you how we're going to do the talk today and do a little introduction. So for the duration of the talk, what we're going to do is keep your computers on mute and turn the videos off. But if you do have any questions that you want to ask Liz, please send them in through the chat option, and then she can take a look at them at the end and try and answer any questions that you've had. So today's talk, basically I heard about this project a few years ago now, and I just thought the topic was so interesting that I thought it would really be an interesting talk, and hopefully you will all enjoy it. I'm sure you really will. So the talk is based on the history of Galkoffs and some of the fascinating stories of Pembroke Place in Liverpool. Today's speaker is Dr Liz Stewart, and she is from National Museums Liverpool. And Liz has been involved with this project right from the very start, and the project actually ran from 2016 to 2018. And also National Museums Liverpool acquired the frontage of Galkoffs, so that's on display now. And I was just checking with Liz, the museum's back open as of next Tuesday, and you're now opening Tuesday to Sunday, I believe. So if after the talk you're inspired and you want to go along and actually see it, I'm sure they'd love to see you there. So today's talk is Galkoffs and the Secret Life of Pembroke Place, and today's speaker is Dr Liz Stewart of National Museums Liverpool. So over to you, Liz.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Jo. Thanks for that lovely introduction, and thanks everybody for joining us this afternoon. I see quite a lot of familiar names, which is absolutely lovely to welcome some of the Galkoff extended family today. So as Jo said, this is a kind of roundup of what I think of as kind of one of the kind of career highlight projects that I've ever done, which was Galkoffs and the Secret Life of Pembroke Place. From the very start, I want to say that I wasn't by any means the only person involved in running this project. Before I was even involved, there was a really active, brilliant kind of stakeholder group who really drove forward delivering this project. And the project research and exhibition were curated by Poppy Learman, who now works at the British Museum. So as I'm the one left at the Museum of Liverpool, I tend to be the person doing this talk, but it comes out of the work of a lot of individuals, all of whom deserve a lot of thanks. So the Galkoffs and Secret Life of Pembroke Place project really grew out of a fascination with the Galkoffs tiles, that amazing tile frontage that you can see represented in this logo, and the real significance of that for Liverpool's heritage, the heritage of Liverpool's Jewish community, and the heritage of that area of Pembroke Place. But as I'll describe this afternoon, we sort of started with the Galkoff tiles, and then we started exploring the kind of wider street. And the project took us on a real journey. So we wanted to look at Pembroke Place Galkoffs in the context of Pembroke Place. And the project was delivered as a partnership between the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, who owned the Galkoffs building, and several other buildings on the street, and the vast majority of their history is associated with Pembroke Place. And they partnered with us at National Museums Liverpool, the Museum of Liverpool, who obviously we brought the heritage expertise and the opportunity to preserve the tiles in the museum collection. We're very fortunate in receiving funding from the National Lottery Heritage Fund, as well as some other partnership funding, but without the National Lottery Heritage Fund, this project couldn't have happened, and that's true of quite a lot of projects I've delivered in my career, so very much hats off to Heritage Fund as well. So as I said, we started looking at the tile frontage of Galkoffs, which you can see in the background of this photograph, and we were very concerned for the future of that heritage item. And then we kind of widened the story out to the whole of Pembroke Place. So Pembroke Place is a street that runs east out of Liverpool. It's a pretty major highway, and one of the reasons why the Galkoff tiles were so kind of recognised and loved is that Pembroke Place is a major bus route and a major kind of car route. A lot of people drove past those tiles, and a lot of people said to us that they were very concerned for the future of the tiles and the kind of heritage that they encapsulated, which was one of the real kind of drivers in us really wanting to work on this project. So we kind of looked at the heritage stories of the whole of the history of the street. We looked at the first people on the street, we looked at the courtyard housing, we looked at the church there, we looked at the kind of communities and businesses there, and we looked at Galkoffs as well. So there's a real broad range of different elements of the heritage and different elements of the project. And what we tried to do is we applied kind of different approaches, looking at different parts of the heritage, and I'll talk you through some of that this afternoon. So as I've said, Pembroke Place is this street that runs out kind of east-west out of Liverpool. It's as you see the road forking on those two historic maps, it's the lower of the two forks. And it's seen here on the 1786 Eyes map, and then again on the 1835 Gauge map. And you can really see the massive change that happened in the later 18th and early 19th century in this area. It's a street that originally was laid out just as communications out of the town of Liverpool. It's marked on the Eyes map there as Road to Wavertree. It was variously known as Road to Wavertree, Road to Prescott, Road to London. It kind of went everywhere, this road, and then became a sort of major thoroughfare in the kind of urban built-up area of Liverpool by the early 19th century. And so by the time of the Eyes map shown here, 1836, we already have the block of buildings which included the Galkoff's kosher butcher shop. But at the time, it would have been a house. The Galkoff was built as a house and later converted to commercial use. So the very first people living on Pembroke Place were some of the wealthier people who moved out of the centre of the town of Liverpool and moved into sort of beautiful houses on the edge of the town to escape the kind of central Liverpool kind of urban environment and live in this kind of sort of slightly detached area of Liverpool. A book written in the late 19th century but recalling earlier 19th century Liverpool describes Pembroke Place as having a row of goodly mansions. And I think this painting kind of the 1830s kind of shows that kind of notion of these beautiful large houses. And some of the historic maps, again, they show these kind of large grand houses with large gardens as well. And so, you know, these were some of the finer places to live in Liverpool. And the first people living on the street were definitely kind of professional classes. The first known resident of the street was a Mr. Oakes. And actually on one of the maps of the 1790s, his was the only house on the street. And so it was actually labelled as Mr. Oakes's house. And Oak Street, which I'll mention later, is actually named after him. He was a druggist, so kind of predecessor of modern pharmacy. And actually that is the very first example of a long sort of theme of medical history on Pembroke Place. The other early residents of Pembroke Place were merchants, they were wine dealers, there was a slave trader who lived on Pembroke Place. So there was people with that kind of real wealth living in this area of Liverpool. This is actually the home of the slave trader that I mentioned, and it's also the oldest standing building now on Pembroke Place, built in the early 19th century as quite a fine house. And you can see on the right here, it's in use as a nursery, which it's now no longer used. I think it's an empty building at the moment. And so this was the sort of style of housing that was quite common in the early 19th century across the sort of outskirts of Liverpool, you know, rather in the style of the houses that we now see in the Georgian Quarter in kind of larger numbers. So it was, you know, this kind of development of Pembroke Place and this kind of very grand feeling of the goodly mansions of Pembroke Place in the early 19th century. So we started to look at Pembroke Place and we started to do some research. And one of the great advantages of this project was that alongside having this brilliant steering group who worked with us, we also had a very large number of volunteers. We had over 70 volunteers in total who worked with us and scoured historical sources to find out some of the really kind of key stories about the history of Pembroke Place. And that was obviously kind of really important to us in understanding that kind of whole context of the street and how it had changed. But right from the get-go, from just looking at the historic maps, which as an archaeologist by training, the first thing you do is look at the historic maps and see what you can work out. We were coming across real surprises in Pembroke Place's history. So you might be able to see here, and this is the gauge map that I mentioned earlier of 1835. And you might be able to see here that marks on this is a Zoological Gardens. And so this is on a plot which is the size of these kind of large houses and large gardens. So it's a small plot for a zoo, but, you know, a decent sized plot of land. You've got a building and then a series of laid out formal gardens labelled as a zoo. And the really odd thing about this is that we've not been able to find any other reference to this zoo on Pembroke Place in any historical sources. It's a real mystery. There were a number of urban zoos in Liverpool in the 19th century. Liverpool, of course, as a port, received a lot of very exotic goods. And one of the things that came into the port were exotic animals. And it was kind of well known that Liverpool people were more likely to have kind of exotic pets in the 19th and early 20th centuries than you get in most cities. And there are a number of well-known kind of urban zoos, but just not this one. So it's very strange. It's clearly labelled here on the 1835 map, but even by the 1848 first edition Ordnance Survey map, which is one of the first kind of really detailed and accurate maps, it's still laid out. You can still see these same buildings. So it looks like there was something here for 10 or 15 years. And so it's very, very strange that there are no other kind of references to it. But what a start to research to find that there was a zoo on Pembroke Place in the 1830s. So Pembroke Place, as I say, kind of built up gradually, and this is the first edition Ordnance Survey map, and by the time of this being surveyed in 1848, Pembroke Place had been completely built up. And so you still have these large houses, but also you get some real kind of changes in the character of the street. You get institutions starting to come in by the mid-19th century, such as St Silas's Church, which you can see sort of mid-left on this map. And you also get smaller houses, including the Courtyard Housing, which became a kind of real kind of feature of exploring the history of Pembroke Place as well. So Courtyard Housing was an example of high-density, poor-quality housing, which grew up in Liverpool and other northern English cities in the 18th century, and then became especially common in the 19th century. Initially, courtyards were built behind existing streetfront properties. So where you have those large houses, you could get the gardens kind of being filled in with these rows of back-to-back houses, so usually just one room deep and backing onto the next house. And they tended to run at right angles to the street, so there'd be an alleyway in, and then you get the houses kind of running at right angles to the main street. And as I say, they initially kind of filled in these existing spaces in the urban space. So as Liverpool's population was increasing and there was huge demand on housing, particularly housing that was near the areas of work, particularly near the docks, people were using whatever spaces they could and cramming in these very small houses, which, as I say, one room deep, but also only one room wide. So 3 stories tall, 3 rooms. And then gradually, particularly in the 19th century, as new streets were being laid out, especially in North Liverpool, you get the streets laid out in such a way that they could accommodate this courtyard housing as part of the formal kind of planned design. And so Liverpool and Manchester and Leeds became especially kind of common. Court housing became especially common, and courts became especially kind of prevalent in those cities. And one thing you also get in all of those cities is these courts gradually becoming overcrowded. And you can see from this photograph kind of how many people are crammed into living in these courtyards. You get people living in the 3 rooms that I've described, but also often people living in the cellars, and that was a particular problem in Liverpool, and something that in the later 19th century they legislated against to prevent people living in those. But we look at the census of the courts around Pembroke Place, and we see there are families living in the houses and also people living in the cellars. And we see up to around 60 people living in a court of 8 houses. So you've got, you know, very high kind of densities of people living in these courts. Courts had become a real issue by the mid-19th century because they were so overcrowded. They were seen as kind of a real public health problem, a place which was kind of rife with social issues, and you know, disease could become really prevalent. And the cholera maps of the mid-19th century do show kind of outbreaks of cholera in the Pembroke Place area. You know, this was a thing of real concern. And Liverpool is well known for having had the first medical officer of health, effectively the first public health officer, appointed in 1846, Dr William Henry Duncan. And he and then his successors, James Newland and others, really actively campaigned against courtyard housing, campaigned to prevent people living in cellars, as I've mentioned, campaigned to reduce the overcrowding, and campaigned to prevent new courts being built. Kind of running alongside that public health campaign, there was also a campaign by journalists who, I think sometimes slightly voyeuristically, but nonetheless usefully, visited the courts and wrote about them, and described what they saw. So we've got some really interesting kind of sources of historical evidence about the courts, both those on Pembroke Place and elsewhere in Liverpool, the conditions that people were living in, and the sort of situation of the courts. We also, very usefully and interestingly, have a lot of pictorial evidence, so both the maps, like I've shown, and photographs. So a lot of courts were photographed, and were captured in that way, especially immediately before they were demolished. So when there was a programme from the late 19th century of what was known at the time as slum clearance, of courtyards being demolished and replaced with better quality housing, often the corporation would send out their photographers, and they'd photograph these as a record of what was being demolished. So we have some really, really interesting historical evidence around courts. But what we have on Pembroke Place is absolutely unique because it is the only standing remains of courtyard housing. So at 35, 37 and 39 Pembroke Place, we have 3 shops on the street front, and then behind each of those shops we have these small back buildings, which are actually the first houses where there would have been whole courtyards. So these are truncated courts, they've been cut away, and these buildings have only survived because they served a useful purpose in being the back rooms of shops. But this is such a unique and important feature of Pembroke Place that these buildings are now all listed. The one that you can see on the right is owned by the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, and they've been repairing and preserving that building. The one that you can see on the left is owned by John Monk, who runs his business as a tailor there, and so they're all kind of in use and being preserved now. What we're able to do as part of this project and the kind of approach that we took to this was to do some documentary research and find out about the people who lived in these courts. So the photograph on the left, that house was lived in by Mr. and Mrs. Clark and their daughter in 1861. And living in the basement at the time was Mrs. Clark, who was about 25 years older. So we think presumably the grandmother was living kind of separate dwelling in the basement. So we were able to get some of these snippets of the lives that were led in these courts. And the other thing that we were able to do is to do some building recording. So before any potential changes to these buildings, and you can see that there have been a number of changes with windows being blocked and features being just adapted for the sort of present use of the buildings. before any further changes to the buildings, we've captured their current state, and we've done measured drawings and photographic surveys, and that's all lodged with the Merseyside Historic Environment Record now. So that's publicly available information, which will be used in the planning process if there are ever any future plans around these buildings. So we're glad to have been able to capture that, and that was something that we did with volunteers as a training exercise in how to do some of this measured survey work. The third thing that we did in terms of the history of courtyard housing was to look at this court. So the photograph on the left, you might just be able to see in the background, two buildings kind of between the buildings in the foreground, and then right at the back another building. So those distant buildings are on Pembroke Place. They're the ones that we've just been looking at. They're the ones that are still standing. And actually the one in the far background is the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine. And in the foreground is a court which stood on Oak Street. So this is the street parallel to Pembroke Place, named after that Mr. Oakes, who was living there in the 1790s. He was such an important kind of resident. Obviously, he had a street named after him, likely because he owned a lot of the land around there. Another of the streets just off Pembroke Place is Gildart Street, which is named after Richard Gildart, a mayor of Liverpool, and he and his wife owned large areas of land in this area, and that's how street naming often developed in the 19th century. So what we're able to do with this court on Oak Street was to look at it in a really different way. This no longer stands. These photographs were taken in the 1930s, shortly before the court was demolished. This area is now a car park. And anybody who's been following archaeology over the last few years and knows about Richard III knows that archaeologists get quite excited about car parks. And so we thought it was worth having a look to see if there are any physical remains of this court left under the ground. And that's in the context of there having been no excavations previously of courtyard housing in Liverpool. And I think I've already described that, as the population boomed in Liverpool in the 19th century, thousands of people at any one time would have lived in courts. We went from a situation in 1801 where there were around 80,000 people living in Liverpool to by 1901 around 750,000 people living in Liverpool. So you can imagine how many houses needed to be built to accommodate that increase in population. And a lot of those were these very small houses, these courtyard houses. So court living would have been a really, really common experience for people in Liverpool. And yet, archaeologically, it's something we'd never explored previously. So we did an archaeological excavation and we found the courts, which was very satisfying, as I'm sure you can imagine. Any urban excavation tends to be a bit complicated because urban areas tend to be built and rebuilt and present a lot of challenges. So we were absolutely delighted with the level of preservation that was of the cellars of the courts which had stood on Oak Street. And most excitingly, really, in the photograph just on the left, my colleague who's standing up, who's wearing the yellow high-vis jacket, is standing just by one of the light wells, which would have lit the cellar rooms. So just in previous photographs, you might just be able to see in the paving, there are the edges of these light wells. By 1935, the light wells had been filled in. That probably happened around about 1900. There was legislation, as I said, that stopped people from using and living in the cellars. And so what tended to happen was people just kind of filled in those light wells. And what happened here was that people filled in the light wells with all their rubbish from the court. And that's kind of like an archaeologist's dream, really, to have that, like a time capsule, really, of really well preserved, sealed area, everything thrown in. And by look as well, it was quite damp preservation conditions, which means that a lot more kind of organic remains and things survive than is usually the case, particularly in local soils in this region. So we covered all sorts of fascinating finds, which really painted a picture of the life in these courtyards. So we got things like the food that people were eating, these oyster shells, the things they were playing, the domino, We got the clay pipes that they were smoking. We even got their toothpaste. So these really kind of personal objects. And we got some really surprising objects as well. You know, just like we were surprised that there was a zoo on Pembroke Place, we were really surprised with some of the finds that we recovered. So on the left here is an egg. It's a ceramic egg. And nobody in our archaeological team had ever found one of these before. And we've investigated it, and it seems that these ceramic eggs were used by people who were keeping chickens, and they were used to either, we couldn't quite get to the bottom of whether they were to encourage the chickens to lay or to prevent the chickens from pecking their own eggs. We got different stories. But what it does demonstrate is that people were keeping chickens in or near this courtyard, which is really interesting because, as I say, there's a lot of photographs, there's a lot of descriptions of courts, there's a lot of historical evidence. I've never seen one mention of chickens being kept in a courtyard. So this kind of paints a picture that we've not seen before from the historical evidence by adding the archaeology to the mix. So we've kind of added a lot of new information. The other mystery was around these bottles. So we recovered quite a number of complete glass bottles, which anything that you discover archaeologically that's complete is by its nature very exciting, because that's relatively uncommon. People tend to wait and throw things away when they're broken. And these bottles, they were embossed with the names of the companies who filled them with their products. So on the base of a bottle tends to be the details around the maker of the bottle, and on the side of the bottle tends to be the detail about the contents. So we had a lot of evidence to go at. And we looked into the different companies who were selling their products in these bottles. So Heineke and White, for example, was one of the companies. And we found that they were all mineral waters, various different non-alcoholic beverages. So things that we dug up and thought, oh, it's a beer bottle, weren't beer bottles at all. They were all minerals. And we even found a mineral water bottler who had lived in that court on Oak Street. And there was a mineral factory nearby. And it seems that the people living at the court on Oak Street were drinking these minerals. And we didn't find any evidence of any alcoholic drinks at all. And actually, even when we found the stopper, which is the photograph on the right, we thought, it says Cox Ale Stores at Liverpool. And we thought, oh, right, okay, here we go. They've not thrown away the bottles, but we have got the stoppers from the beer bottles. But Cox Ale was a non-alcoholic form of ale. They seem to be actively seeking out the non-alcoholic options, which is quite interesting, particularly when you compare the archaeological evidence again to the historical evidence, because those journalists, and to extent the public health officers, will tend to write about the people who live in courts and say they're drunkards, they're no good, they're wasting all of their money, they can't afford to live in decent housing because they're drinking too much. And the archaeology is telling a completely different story. And we don't know whether it's because these people were all teetotal. We don't know whether there was perhaps some arrangement around that particular court. One of the names given on the maps for that court is Missionary Buildings. And we wonder whether there's an association with the Liverpool City Mission, and at a time of prohibition, whether there was actually encouragement that the people living there couldn't drink alcohol. There may just have been a differentiation in terms of disposal. It could be that if you had a beer bottle, you could take it back to be refilled, and if you had a mineral bottle, you couldn't. There may have been a differentiation like that. We're not sure, but this really did kind of flag up to us that the story we're getting from the historical sources and what we see in the archaeology don't quite marry up. So as I said, we had a lot of volunteers working on the documentary sources to find out as much as we could about the history of Pembroke Place. And having started as this kind of very fine street of grand mansions, the goodly mansions, Pembroke Place kind of descends into being an area which by the 1880s is described in a court case as being little hell. And there were some really, really horrible stories of the things that happened on Pembroke Place. There were accidents, but there were also violent deaths happening on Pembroke Place. And it was quite challenging, actually, some of the things that we were coming back with and reading and finding out about. It was certainly a very difficult area to live. And I think that kind of gives a sort of a picture of the changes in the streets, that it went from being, a very fine place to live to be having some of the poorer quality housing by the later 19th century. But that notwithstanding, there were still some real kind of moments of light and joy in the later 19th century on Pembroke Place. And so in the 1870s and 1880s, we see references to skating at Pembroke Place in newspaper reports. They're advertising skating events. And we thought, oh, that's fascinating, they're ice skating, that's amazing. And then we realised that one of the newspaper reports was from June. And we thought, well, they can't be ice skating in June. And it was a roller skating rink. And I'd never looked into the history of roller skating before, but it turns out roller skates were invented in the 1770s. And by the mid-19th century, there was a real movement that roller skating was going to be the new form of transport, but also was this fabulous kind of entertainment. And there was this fashion of rinkomania in the 1860s and 1870s, kind of seems to start in London, and then Liverpool takes it on a little bit later. And people would wear their roller skates and would dance to music on roller skates. And one of the newspaper reports specifically says that one of the pieces of music that's played at the Pembroke Place skating rink is the Pembroke Waltz. It's composed specifically for this skating rink. And this fabulous photograph in the top left-hand corner here is a Liverpool couple in the 1870s who are on holiday in the Isle of Man. You can see their linked hands. Unfortunately, we haven't got their feet on this version, I'm sorry. But they're wearing roller skates. They are roller skating on holiday. So, there's a lovely kind of pictorial example of that. In fact, it was my colleague at the Walker Art Gallery who gave me this photograph. And she found it several years previously. And as I say, it's a Liverpool couple, but the photograph actually taken in the Isle of Man. And she was just so fascinated with it. She scanned it in. She just kind of kept it to one side. And then when we mentioned this story of the roller skating Victorian, she said, "I've got just the photograph of that. It did happen." And I just think that's a really amazing little piece of history. So as I've said, Pembroke Place kind of changed its character through its history. It started off being residential, but then moved into a far more kind of commercial area. And so this is the first known photograph of Pembroke Place, which dates from 1899, the early street photograph. And so here we see some of the businesses that there were on Pembroke Place at this time. And so you might not quite be able to make it out, but the first building on the left, the sign sort of high up, it says Augers. And that was one business that we found some adverts for, and that was Emily Auger. And she was an ostrich feather cleaner. And so she made ostrich feathers ready for ladies' hats, with plumes in ladies' hats. We also see a number of furniture shops. So actually, the third shop along, you might just be able to make out there's a few things kind of outside that shop. They're items of furniture. And that's the shop that later becomes Galkoff's. And the sort of theme of furniture shops kind of runs through Pembroke Place and is a type of business that we see time and time again. And so we see this kind of commercial area kind of building up by the 1870s, 1880s. You get far more kind of shops and small businesses kind of developing in this area. One of our volunteers who worked with us was very keen on colorising photographs. So he's had a go at colorising that photograph we just saw. And I think that's amazing. It just brings them to life so much, doesn't it, to see them in colour. And so here are just a few of the examples of the different types of shops. So Globe Furnishing, that was a Jewish company established in the later 19th century and continued for a very long time through into the later 20th century. The Alexander Furnishing, the Llama Bedding Company, and Poppy could never quite get her head around this. The project curator, she couldn't quite get why there would have been a company called the Llama Bedding Company. It just seems so strange, doesn't it? And then there are a number of food shops as well. So there are cocoa houses, grocers, and there are also butcher shops. And obviously Galkoff is a key example of that, but was by no means the only butcher shop, and by no means the only Jewish or kosher butcher shop in this area either. So this is one of the adverts for Globe Furniture. There's actually a very faint ghost sign on the wall, painted sign on the wall behind one of the shops, which says Globe, which is the sort of remnant of this business on the street. But we like this advert particularly because it shows some of the products that are being sold, which are known as the Pembroke suites. And so you've got that kind of, again, that use of the street name, Pembroke, in some of these adverts, just the way that you've had, earlier as well. We don't entirely know why Pembroke Place got its name, Pembroke Place. As I said at the beginning, it had previously known as sort of Road to Wavertree or Road to Prescott, and formerly got its name Pembroke Place about 1800 or 1801. And we think it was probably after the 11th Earl of Pembroke, who was something of a military hero at the time. So we think that that's where the name came from, but it certainly stuck with some of the marketing around some of the furniture. And it's quite interesting that furniture still plays a really significant part on this street. There are a number of furniture shops still in this area, and also fabric shops and upholstery shops. It's still the place to go for fabrics or cushions or whatever. And the area is actually sort of undergoing a bit of regeneration, being branded as the fabric district now. So it's quite nice that you've got that kind of longevity of history of some of these types of businesses. As I mentioned when we discussed Mr. Oakes, there is also this kind of long history of a medical kind of interest in Pembroke Place. So Mr. Oakes was the druggist, the pharmacist in modern terms. And Pembroke Place also had one of the early Liverpool Royal Infirmaries. So it was this infirmary which was built in 1890, which was kind of one of the first really grand, very medicalised buildings. And you can probably see this is a very kind of clean, tiled interior in this building. And this remained a hospital until 1978, and everybody in Liverpool still sort of recognises it as the old infirmary, and in fact it's not very far away from the new infirmary. It's very close by, and this building even now is a doctor's surgery, so maintains that kind of medical story. And the very fact of Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine spending their history on the street, again, it's that kind of medical link. The school themselves, as I said, are a partner in the project, and they have a very interesting history of their own. They were established in the late 19th century, and it's arguable whether they or the London School was the first in the world to study tropical disease. It depends what you count as being established, but they were within months of one another, and Liverpool definitely claims it. It was established with funding from Alfred Lewis Jones, who was ran the shipping company, Jones Shipping Company. And while it was a sort of philanthropic investment, it was also quite a practical investment, in that he wanted to ensure that his sailors were not going to become sick when they're travelling to tropical countries. The school moved to what they now call the Old School, which is the whole of this building that you see in the architectural drawing. It was built in two phases. So they've built this phase on the left second, but it is now that sort of double-fronted building. They moved there in 1918. It had actually been ready in 1914 and had been used as a military hospital during the First World War. And the school moved in 1918 and have expanded massively, particularly in the last 10 or 15 years. And undertake obviously a lot of research, both in Liverpool, but also at campuses in Malawi and elsewhere. And they're doing a vast amount of really important work. They were one of the major hubs in testing some of the COVID vaccines last year. Another feature of Pembroke Place, which is very kind of evocative of these changes on the street, is St Silas's Church. St Silas's was built in 1848, and demolished in 1948. It survived exactly 100 years. Demolished after Second World War bomb damage, but also because it didn't have a congregation of any kind of active number by the 1940s. This was an area of Liverpool that had become associated with both the Jewish community, but also some of the nonconformist churches as well. And this was a Church of England church, so there wasn't a congregation in the area, so it was closed in the 1940s and, as I say, demolished in 1948. Liverpool's Jewish community is pretty much synonymous with this area of Liverpool in the end of the 19th century and through the first half of the 20th century. But actually, Liverpool's Jewish community has a very long history. The earliest records of the Jewish community date back to the 1750s, which makes it the oldest kind of provincial Jewish community in Britain. And there was even a synagogue as early as 1752, and obviously these things are established very, very early by the Jewish community. And this whole area between Islington, which is about 3 blocks to the north of Pembroke Place, Brownlow Hill, which is again about 3 blocks to the south of Pembroke Place, that whole area was really very closely associated with the Jewish community, and we get a lot of the sort of Jewish businesses, including butcher shops, developing in this area. So one of our teams of volunteers specifically looked at the history of kosher butchery in Liverpool, and this was a really fascinating kind of theme of research. When the Jewish community established itself, one of the first things that it needed was kosher butchery in order to survive. And so what we see on this early 20th century map is just some of the examples of the 101 kosher butchers and delis that are recorded from the mid-19th century to the mid-20th century in this area of Liverpool. It's absolutely fascinating to see how many of these businesses developed in Liverpool. Percy Galkoff, who ran Galkoff's kosher butcher shop, was absolutely kind of at the heart of this work. He was one of the members of the Hebrew Butchers Association, who agreed the standards for meats, and also some of the pricing for meats, so there wasn't sort of price wars between all of these different businesses. He was an absolute kind of pillar of the community in Liverpool. And it was absolutely fascinating to look at Percy Galkoff's sort of history. And one of the things we were able to do was to trace some of his family story and to speak to members of the Jewish community who were fortunate enough to have met, a number of members of the Jewish community who have memories of Galkoff's. So we worked with this artist, Sophie Herxheimer, who collected people's memories, and she collects stories live in ink. So she records kind of what people are saying. She's an artist, a visual artist, and a poet, so a really talented woman. And you see here with the drawing with the 2 bikes, there's the story of 2 delivery boys who delivered meat for Galkoff's, and one on each side of the river. So one over in Wallasey, where there was a branch of family and a branch of the shop. The building still stands, but with no remnants of the butcher's shop now. And one delivering meat on the Liverpool side of the river. And these 2 twin boys, who are described as having flaming red hair, would go off on their bikes around Merseyside delivering the meat. Another brilliant story that Sophie captured was of meat being put on the trains with the drivers to be transported and delivered. It was very well sought after. It's a very well-known business, and very high quality meats and sausages they were well known for. And so they were delivered right around Merseyside. And we're able to trace, as I say, quite a lot of Percy Galkoff's family history, and working with the Galkoff family to do that was absolutely fascinating. So Percy was born in Poland and grew up in a small town in Poland called Szradz, which is near Łódź. And he moved over to England as a teenager. He arrived on the east coast of Britain. We think probably Hull. That's where a lot of Jewish migrants came into into Britain. And then he seems to have moved over to Liverpool relatively quickly. He marries a Jewish woman, and they establish this business quite quickly. And actually, one of the things that we discovered from looking at the family records was that actually both of Percy Galkoff's grandfathers were butchers. So he would have had some of the kind of knowledge about kosher butchery to be able to bring to this country and to establish this great business. And so he establishes the business by around 1910. And obviously works very hard to build the business up, and it moves into this property just a few years later. But the iconic tiles aren't added for a few years yet. Obviously, that's a major investment in a business to put such absolutely bespoke tile frontage on the shop. And we think that they were added in 1933. There seems to have been quite a remodelling of the building inside and out, and actually we found written behind the fireplace in the building a date and the name of a building. We think that probably ties to this remodelling of the building. The tiles are certainly very consistent with the early 1930s, and they're this absolutely beautiful kind of slightly Art Deco style, particularly in the lettering and these checkerboard tiles, absolutely beautiful. This photograph was taken in the 1990s, and sadly, following this, there was further damage to the frontage. The shop wasn't acquired by Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine until 2012. And by that time, it was described structurally as being dangerously unstable because it hadn't had the investment it needed. There'd been several attempts to try to preserve and reuse the building, which sadly hadn't taken off. So we employed conservators to remove the tiles from the building and to preserve them and bring them into the Museum of Liverpool as part of the collection. And alongside that, we have also acquired a number of items from inside the building, including things like meat hooks and a butcher's marble slab. But it was the tiles that were particularly challenging, as I'm sure you can imagine. They needed to be removed from the building, and unfortunately this had to happen in December, which was not the easiest time of year to work, which is why my colleague here is so very kind of wrapped up. There were a total of over 850 tiles on the building, and they were all labelled individually so that the conservators would know which tile came from where, and they could all be put back in the perfect order. But actually getting them off the building proved really, really difficult. They had been attached with 3 layers of mortar with chicken wire between, so it was really, really difficult to actually remove these tiles from the building. It was a very, very fine piece of building work when these tiles were added. So they were cut away from the building with diamond cutters. The mortar was then trimmed away from the back, and each tile now still has about 5 millimeters of mortar on the back of the tiles. Every tile was cleaned, tiles were repaired so that any missing sections where maybe cracks and freeze-thaw action had pushed away parts of the glaze of the tiles were all repaired really beautifully, colour matched fantastically. Around 100 new tiles had to be made, and they were made at Ironbridge. That's quite possibly where the original tiles came from, but sadly there's no marking on the back of the tiles where we've had the tiles with the mortar removed. There's no marking on the back of the tiles, so it's almost impossible to track down where they were made. And then the tiles have been mounted into these modular trays, and there are 16 trays in total which make up the frontage, and so they're all hooked onto a structure, a frame in the Museum of Liverpool, which looks something like this. And the idea about that is that we've committed to these being on display for several years, but we're thinking that at some point somebody would possibly want to borrow them, and if that was the case, then they could easily be transported, very safely transported. So the tiles and a number of other items that explore the stories of Pembroke Place have been brought into the museum and put in the exhibition Galkoff's and the Secret Life of Pembroke Place, which is in the People's Republic Gallery in the museum. I particularly love this photograph in the top left-hand corner for two reasons, really. Well, three reasons. It's got the beautiful tiles in it. Through the tiles, you can see the Liver building, which kind of just shows the kind of, prominent location that we've been able to put the tiles in, which I'm just so pleased with. I love it when I walk into this gallery and they're huge, and they're there. It's the whole front of the building. And then thirdly, you've got Poppy on the screen talking about the history of Pembroke Place and all the research that she undertook with the volunteers on this project. We've done a lot of other little things throughout the project. So in the bottom left here is a trail that we created. There's a lot of digital resources on our website associated with the project. There's an installation that we created about the history of Pembroke Place, which has been installed at King David High School as a sort of memory of the history of the community on Pembroke Place. And so we've tried to kind of have a number of different outputs that engage people in lots of different ways about the history of the street. This has been one of the most exciting projects I've ever worked on. I've thoroughly enjoyed exploring the history of the street and of Galkoff and the Galkoff family. It's a project that I got a massive amount out of, and an exhibition which I hope that you'll enjoy if you haven't already visited. As Joe said, we're open again from Tuesday. Book in, and we'd absolutely love to welcome you to the Museum of Liverpool. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Liz. That was fascinating. Thank you so much for that. I'm just trying to get my video to play. Well, it's not doing, but you can hear me anyway. Might pop up at some point. Right, so thank you very much for that. There has a few questions come through, so if you want to take a second to have a look at them, and then I'll just do a quick shout out for what we've got coming up. So on the 2nd of June at 7 o'clock, we've got the Mad Moles of Edge Hill, past and present, which is a talk about the Williamson tunnels. And the gentleman who's doing that, Tom Stapleton, actually wanted to be with us today because he wanted to listen to Liz's talk. And he's actually ended up working today, so sadly he couldn't join us. But yeah, so if you want to come along to that one, that's on the 2nd of June at 7 o'clock. The next lunchtime talk is on the 9th of June at 1 o'clock. And this time we're doing something a little bit different. So what we're actually doing is, some people may have already encountered Phil Gregson. He's a local wheelwright, and he lives in Banks, and he does the most amazing work. It's like he's a wheelwright, his dad and granddad were a wheelwright, his mum and dad were both wheelwrights, and he's kind of carrying on the family trade, but he also brings to it such an amazing passion for history as well, so he always brings that to his work. So somebody's actually done a film about him. So the next talk that we're going to be doing is a bit different, as in we're going to be showing the film. But what's going to happen is Phil is actually going to come along, so he's going to be here to answer any questions that you may have at the end of it, if you want to join us for that one. And if you want to come along to the Atkinson, we actually reopen on Monday. We've got reduced hours. I believe we're still only opening till 4 o'clock. But the museum will be open, the library's open, and we do have one exhibition in the gallery which will be open, which is an exhibition by a Japanese artist called Rune Matsunaga. The work's beautiful. It's kind of a bit Hieronymus Bosch in style, but it's absolutely fascinating. You can actually see it online if you can't go along to see us. Any information you want, actually come and have a look at the website. If you've got any questions, forward them through to Liz now and she can have a look at them. And if you've got anything that you want to pass on to her or any questions you'd rather ask in private, if you have a look at our website, there's a contact for the Atkinson. If you send it through to them, I'll make sure that it gets onto Liz at the end. So can I just quickly say, I'm absolutely fascinated with the zoo.
Yeah, it was one of our first discoveries, and it was one of those moments you realise this project was going to go well. If you can discover a zoo in your first kind of initial research, yeah, it's amazing, isn't it?
I know, and it sort of just sprung to mind. You know, was it a couple of years ago when somebody found a dead crocodile in the middle of Liverpool? And everybody was like stepping over it because they thought it was a log or something. I was thinking, for some reason, it's like, oh my God, is this still kind of somehow going on in quiet somewhere?
All these weird things that happen. Yeah, exactly.
Right. Have you had a chance to look at any of the questions?
Yes, we've had a few questions. People were asking about the exhibition, saying that the tile frontage is on display in the museum, as I'd said. And I should just also say that along with the tiles, which obviously are the absolute star of the show, we were really fortunate that a number of people contacted us through the project and shared their stories, and a lot of those are on display. Those stories that Sophie Herxheimer captured, a lot of those are on display, and also shared some other really amazing objects. So we have, for example, the white butcher's coat and knife that were used in Galkoff's, actually by Izzy Silver, who was Percy Galkoff's kind of business partner in the 1960s. So to have some of those like absolutely amazing objects and to be able to display those in the museums, absolutely brilliant. Somebody was asking about Rob Ainsworth's role in preserving Galkoff. Yes, absolutely. Rob bought the shop in, I think, the 80s from memory, and he was desperately trying to preserve it. And it's down to him that it wasn't demolished at that point. But unfortunately, he was in that period when it was very difficult to get kind of investment and to get things happening on the street. So unfortunately, it wasn't put to a different use. So history became what it was, and we have the tiles in the museum now. Somebody told me that their dad had a shoe wholesaling business on at Islington. The sort of fabric and clothing, and I suppose includes shoemaking kind of businesses across that area, really common. And it's great to kind of hear about those details of all those different businesses. Wow, what else have we got here? Somebody talking about feeding the chickens. Yeah, there's kind of memories of there being chickens in the backyard at Galkoff's, and them kind of being kept sort of live there, ready for people to go and choose which one they wanted. I'm vegetarian, so this is all kind of a bit of an alien kind of concept to me. So, hi Rochelle. A grandchild of Percy. Yes, I think we met a couple of years ago now. It's been fantastic to have the support of the Galkoff family throughout this project. It's so nice to see a couple of people here, the extended Galkoff family. Thank you very, very much for all of your support. Somebody said, when did the Jewish community move into Pembroke Place, and did you find evidence of where other residents came from? So we sort of start to see the Jewish community in the Pembroke Place area from the later 19th century. We did actually find one Jewish resident of Pembroke Place actually living in the court housing at one point as well, because that was one of the areas we looked at the census research in a lot of detail. So the later 19th century, you get people moving there. They are primarily people who are from Eastern Europe, so this is part of the pogroms of people being driven out of Eastern Europe and migrating across Europe. And as I said, we think that the Galkoff family, Percy Galkoff, would have come into Hull. What was quite a common kind of route that people took, and then obviously people settled across different towns and cities in Britain, and Liverpool was one of those kind of heartlands. It's quite a small Jewish community in Liverpool now, quite an aging Jewish community generally in Liverpool now. But in the early 20th century, it was a very, very vibrant community. There was a community centre, and a lot of very vibrant things happening. But the community sort of moved away from the city centre as the character of the city centre again sort of changed, so moved away from that area, and there's a bit of a kind of Jewish community sort of centre around sort of Childwall area now, but there are Jewish people who live right across Merseyside as well. So lots of changes to the community through time. Yeah, somebody said, you mentioned that there were 101 kosher butchers and delis, and now there are none. Yes, it's amazing, isn't it? That's obviously the change in the community. And somebody saying my grandparents had a grocers and bakers on Crown Street, Alberts. Yeah. So yeah, lots of brilliant kind of personal connections with the area, which is really fascinating. So thanks very much for all those comments, everyone.
Oh, lovely. Oh, thanks, Liz. Genuinely been a pleasure. It's been nice seeing you again. So thank you to everybody for joining us today. Hopefully you'll join us again soon. And as I said, if you do have any questions you want to pass on to Liz, send them on through our website at the Atkinson, and I will make sure that Liz receives anything that's sent on to her. So
contact details were on that last slide. If anybody
okay.
Scribble them down, you can tweet me or email me directly. That's absolutely fine. I'll be lovely to hear from you.
Lovely. So thank you very much. Hope everybody has a lovely afternoon, and hope to see you all again soon. See you soon, Liz.
Thank you. Bye now.
Take care.